द वे फॉरवर्ड इज थोड़ा बहुत बहुत स्वागत है। मैं थोड़ा होस्ट हरजोत सिंह। ਅੱਜ ਜਦ ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ ਰਿਕਾਰਡ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਥਰਸਡੇ ਜਨਵਰੀ 27 ਔਰ ਅੱਜ ਇਸ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਤੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ। ਬੜਾ ਪੋਸੀਬਲ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਹੈ ਜਦ ਇਹ ਪ੍ਰੋਗਰਾਮ 에ਅਰ ਹੋਣਾ ਹੈ ਸੈਟਰਡੇ 29 ਨੂੰ ਤਦ ਤੱਕ ਇਹ ਟੌਪਿਕ ਰਿਡੰਡੈਂਟ ਹੋ ਜਾਏ। ਮੈਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਇਸ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਕਹਿ ਰਿਹਾ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਵਿੱਚ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਇੰਨੀ ਸੈਂਸਿਟਿਵ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਉੱਥੇ ਕਦੇ ਵੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲੜਾਈ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਸਕਦੀ ਹੈ। ਅਸੀਂ ਇਸ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਹੋਰ ਬੈਟਰ ਸਮਝਣ ਲਈ ਅੱਜ ਇਨਵਾਈਟ ਕੀਤਾ ਹੈ ਆਪਣੇ ਚੀਫ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਐਨਾਲਿਸਟ ਗੁਰਸ਼ੇਰ ਗਿੱਲ ਜੀ ਨੂੰ। ਗੁਰਸ਼ੇਰ, ਯੂ ਵੈਰੀ ਵੈਲਕਮ।
Thank you, Harjot. Always a pleasure to be with you. Looking forward to it.
Gursher, as we said, it's a very sensitive situation. और हो सकता है कि जब तक साडा ये प्रोग्राम एयर होंदा है सैटरडे ਨੂੰ तब तक जिस लड़ाई ਦੀ ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਲੱਗੇ ਆ ਉਹ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋ ਜਾਏ। ਕੀ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਲੱਗ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਕਿਆ ਇਹ ਪੋਸਿਬਿਲਿਟੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ?
ਹਰਜੋਤ, ਕਾਫੀ ਪੋਸਿਬਿਲਿਟੀਜ਼ ਹੈਗੀਆਂ ਤੇ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਅੱਜ ਕੱਲ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਕਾਫੀ ਟੈਂਸਡ ਹੈ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਵਾਰ ਲਾਈਕ ਐਟਮੋਸਫੀਅਰ ਬਣ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਹੈ ਹੁਣ। nobody can perfectly guess ਕਿ ਕਦੋਂ ਇਹ ਵਾਰ ਹੋਊਗੀ ਜਾਂ ਛਿੜੂਗੀ ਜਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਛੋਟਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਇੱਕ ਸਰਜੀਕਲ ਕਾਈਂਡ ਆਫ ਆਪਰੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੋਊਗਾ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਵੱਲੋਂ। ਕੋਈ ਗੈਸ ਨਹੀਂ ਕਰ ਸਕਦਾ, ਨਾ ਹੀ ਕੋਈ ਇਹਦੀ ਟਾਈਮਲਾਈਨ ਗੈਸ ਕਰ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ। ਮੇਰਾ ਐਸਟੀਮੇਸ਼ਨ ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਬਿਕੋਜ਼ ਆਫ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਬੀਜਿੰਗ ਓਲੰਪਿਕਸ ਚੱਲ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਦੇ ਕਰਕੇ ਚਾਈਨਾ ਨੇ ਕੁਝ ਪ੍ਰੈਸ਼ਰ ਪਾਇਆ ਹੋਣਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ ਇਟਸ ਅ ਗਲੋਬਲ ਇਵੈਂਟ ਤੇ ਜੋ ਵੀ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਕਰਨਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ ਐਟ ਦਿਸ ਪੁਆਇੰਟ ਆਫ ਟਾਈਮ may be delayed by a couple of weeks. So that is my best guess in terms of timeline. But obviously ਜਿਹੜੇ diplomatic paths हैं वो भी चल रहे हैं in the parallel. There are a lot of countries involved. United States is also involved. ਤੇ ਕੀ ਪਤਾ ਕੋਈ solution ਉਹਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਨਿਕਲ ਜਾਏ ਤੇ ਇਹ war ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਨਾ ਹੋਏ ਜਾਂ ਫਿਰ ਕੋਈ event ਨਾ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਹੋਏ war like.
ਗੁਰਸ਼ੇਰ, ਅਸੀਂ ਆਪਣੇ ਵਿਊਅਰਸ ਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਦਈਏ ਕਿ ਐਜ਼ ਵੀ ਸਪੀਕ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦੇ ਕੋਈ 1 ਲੱਖ ਦੇ ਤਾਦਾਦ ਦੇ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਟਰੂਪਸ ਹਨ ਉਹ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਖੜੇ ਨੇ। ਤਕਰੀਬਨ 62 ਬਟਾਲੀਅਨਸ ਟੈਕਟੀਕਲ ਗਰੁੱਪਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਉੱਥੇ ਡਿਪਲੋਏ ਕੀਤੇ ਹੋਏ ਨੇ। ਬਲੈਕ ਸੀ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸ਼ਿਪਸ ਹਨ ਉਹ ਮੋਬਿਲਾਈਜ਼ ਕੀਤੀ ਜਾ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ। ਨੈਟੋ ਦੀ ਤਰਫੋਂ ਯੂਐਸ ਦੀ ਤਰਫੋਂ ਕਿਆ ਉੱਥੇ ਕੋਈ ਗਰਾਊਂਡ ਤੇ ਫੋਰਸਿਸ ਭੇਜੀ ਗਈ ਹਨ?
ਦੇਖੋ ਜੀ ਹਰਜੋਤ, ਜਦੋਂ ਦਾ 2014 ਤੇ ਕ੍ਰਾਈਮੀਆ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਐਨੈਕਸ ਕੀਤਾ ਸੀ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਨੇ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਤੋਂ, ਉਹ ਤੋਂ ਬਾਅਦ US along with its allies have supported Ukraine from defense perspective. That means sending them strategic weaponry, supporting them with funds for defense spending, supporting them with the training resources on the ground, both from NATO's side and from the United States side. So वो तो चल ही रहा है पिछले 6-7 सालों तो। Along with that, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉਹ news ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, United States sent about 90 tons of lethal aid to Ukraine in the last 1 week. Lethal aid means it could be anything, so they're not disclosing what it was. Dooja, UK has also sent some weaponry. About a few weeks back, United States and NATO had also sent some anti-tank weaponry to the ਜਿਹੜੇ Javelin shoulder-based missile system ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਉਹ ਵੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ ਦਿੱਤਾ ਹੈ। Plus NATO ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ and the United Nations and United States has also gathered about 8,500 combat-ready troops, not in Ukraine but in surrounding NATO states as well. So ਇਹ ਸਾਰਾ ਚੱਲ ਰਿਹਾ in the background. Obviously United States, they NATO want to at least show a posture ki they are ready as well, not from a Ukraine defending perspective but defending the other NATO member states perspective.
We want to take advantage of your presence here today. ਸਾਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਾਓ ਕਿ ਇਸ ਸਾਰੀ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਦੀ ਬੈਕਗ੍ਰਾਉਂਡ ਕੀ ਹੈ। as we understand, ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦੇ ਨੇਬਰਹੁੱਡ 'ਚ ਹੈ। ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦਾ ਇਹ ਇੰਟਰਸਟ ਹੋਣਾ ਚਾਹੀਦਾ, ਹੋ ਸਕਦਾ ਹੈ ਕਿ they don't want कि भाई तुसी अपनी ਜਿਹੜੀ NATO ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਔਰ ਆਪਣੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਉੱਥੇ defense installments ਕਰੋ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਆਸ-ਪਾਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਨੇੜੇ. Why is Russia wrong in that? What's the background of the situation?
There are multiple backgrounds, Harjot. ਅਸੀਂ ਪੂਰਾ ਇੱਕ episode ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ, couple of episode ਕਰ ਸਕਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ what has been the reasoning ਕਿ Russia ਇੱਥੇ ਪਹੁੰਚ ਗਿਆ ਹੈ. But ਜਿਹੜਾ high level understanding ਇਹ ਹੈ ਕਿ Russia wants to maintain its sphere of influence on the breakaway USSR countries, which are obviously you saw last week what happened in Kazakhstan. Ukraine is another breakaway republic. Georgia is. Estonia and Latvia is already NATO members, so he cannot basically influence them. Belarus is a big supporter of Russia. ਉੱਥੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਿਆ ਹੋਣਾ ਪਿਛਲੇ 6 ਮਹੀਨੇ 'ਚ ਕਿੰਨੀ ਅਪਰਾਈਜ਼ਿੰਗ ਹੋਈ ਸੀ. ਉੱਥੇ ਵੀ ਆਲਮੋਸਟ ਡਿਕਟੇਟਰਸ਼ਿਪ ਆ ਗਈ ਹੈ. ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਟ ਹੈਗੇ ਹੀ ਇਜ਼ ਨਾਟ ਸਟੈਪਿੰਗ ਡਾਊਨ. ਸੋ Russia wants to maintain a sphere of influence on all breakaway USSR countries. Why? Obviously, it is in their interest. They say कि ये सारे breakaway countries हैं. Eventually, President Putin, obviously, if you go through his history, he wants to bring the USSR together. So that is the main goal. So having that goal in mind, Mr. Putin is obviously worried about NATO and United States funding of the NATO and overall NATO presence in that region. So he has got a good excuse with Ukraine now. So and he knows that Ukraine is not the strongest. What he has done with Crimea, he got away with it. So he's obviously more motivated, and he knows that there were not really huge repercussions to it. So he can get away with it. So he's going to do this again.
Gursher, मैं ना एक चीज ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਵਿੱਚ ਇੱਕ ਚੀਜ਼ ਪੁੱਛਣਾ ਚਾਹੁੰਦਾ. ਸਾਡੇ ਕਈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਰਿਪਬਲਿਕਨ ਫਰੈਂਡਸ ਹੈਗੇ, ਕਈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਟ ਟਰੰਪ ਨੂੰ ਬੜਾ ਸਪੋਰਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਨੇ, ਉਹ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਪਏ ਕਿ ਬਈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਮਤਲਬ ਦਿਸ ਇਜ਼ ਫॉर एवरीवन टू सी ਕਿ ਟਰੰਪ ਦੇ ਦੌਰਾਨ ਪਿਊਟਿਨ ਨੇ ਇਹ ਹਰਕਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ, ਇਹ ਹਿੰਮਤ ਨਹੀਂ ਕੀਤੀ. ਇਟਸ ਜਸਟ ਬਿਕਾਜ਼ ਬਾਈਡਨ ਇਜ਼ ਵੀਕ ਔਰ ਦ ਡੈਮੋਕ੍ਰੈਟਸ ਆਰ ਵੀਕ ਕਿ ਬਈ ਜਦ ਇਹ ਹੁੰਦੇ ਤੇ ਇਹ ਸਾਰੀ ਮੂਵਮੈਂਟਸ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖਦੇ ਹਾਂ. ਕੀ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿਣਾ ਚਾਹੋਗੇ ਇਸ ਬਾਰੇ 'ਚ?
I mean, देखिए जी, Trump supporters have their right to say whatever they want to, and so our Biden supporters have the right to say. But if I look at the bigger picture, ਜਦੋਂ Trump president ਸੀ, Mr. Trump, he also did not have the best relations with the NATO members and the top NATO members, not the entire NATO membership. And I mean, you have seen there's a very famous picture of him sitting on a desk and Angela Merkel really addressing him on the table that he was not in line with the thinking of the other NATO members, and he had publicly stated that he wants to pull out from NATO or reduce the spending in NATO. So if you look at all those factors, and plus he had also pulled out weaponry from a lot of the NATO member states as well, as you may know. So it was working in Russia's favor at that point of time. So they had all the time in the world where Mr. Trump was negotiating or damaging the relationship with NATO's. I mean, US is a critical member of NATO. I mean, United States spends 70% of the defense budget of NATO. They contribute towards NATO defense spending. So for US to come out of it, it's a big deal. So I don't think that argument holds value. I think there are different policies at play out here, but Mr. Biden has a different approach towards this, and he's trying to take everybody together to have a cohesive response along with the allies in Europe to make sure that Russia has the biggest impact, whether it's whether it's personal sanctions, whether it's economic sanctions, whether it's defense related sanctions, but that's financial sanctions as well.
ਜਿਹੜੇ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ NATO forces ਦੀ US ਦੀ presence ਦੀ ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜੀ emboldenment ਅਸੀਂ Putin ਵਿੱਚ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, that could be ascribed ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਫੋਰਸਿਸ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ US ਫੋਰਸਿਸ NATO ਫੋਰਸਿਸ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਰਿਲੇਸ਼ਨ ਆਪਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਵੀਕਨਿੰਗ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਔਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਫੋਰਸਿਸ ਹਨ ਉਧਰ ਯੂਰਪ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹ ਵਿਡਰਾ ਕਰ ਜੋ ਪ੍ਰੈਜ਼ੀਡੈਂਟ ਟਰੰਪ ਦੇ ਦੁਆਰਾ ਵਿਡਰਾ ਕੀਤੀ ਗਈ ਉਸ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਐਮਬੋਲਡਮੈਂਟ ਅਸੀਂ ਦੇਖ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਪੁਟਿਨ ਦੀ that could be a direct cause. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, that is one factor of it. Other factor is that, nothing really happened to Russia after the annexation of Crimea, so he got more emboldened because of that as well. Plus, the other geopolitical this thing, the fact that Syria was supported by Russia, that's another emboldened step for Mr. Putin, because that was a playground for Russian forces, right? To have to be involved in a conflict so far out in Middle East and sending their weaponry ships, Navy, Air Force, and armed forces right over there, and nobody did anything to that. So there are multiple factors. One of them is what you just stated.
Gursher, ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਗੱਲ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ The Way Forward। The Way Forward ਵਿੱਚ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। ਅੱਜ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਇੱਕ ਇਮਰਜਿੰਗ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਜੋ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਔਰ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ ਕੰਫਲਿਕਟ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਨਜ਼ਰ ਆ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ ਉਸ ਬਾਰੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਇੰਟਰਨੈਸ਼ਨਲ ਐਨਾਲਿਸਟ ਗੁਰਸ਼ੇਰ ਗਿੱਲ ਦੇ ਨਾਲ। ਗੁਰਸ਼ੇਰ, ਇਸ ਸਾਰੀ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਅਸੀਂ ਥੋੜਾ ਹੋਰ ਸਮਝਾਂਗੇ ਔਰ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਨੈਟੋ ਦਾ ਰੋਲ ਹੈ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਪਲੀਜ਼ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਦੱਸੋ ਇਹ ਜੋ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਹੈ 5000 ਮੀਲ ਦੂਰ US ਤੋਂ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦੇ ਬਾਰਡਰ ਤੇ ਇੱਕ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ। ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਆਪਣੇ ਉਸ ਕੰਟਰੀ ਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ for whatever reasons ਉੱਥੇ ਅਟੈਕ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਹੈ। US ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈ is it a direct conflict between US and Russia or we hear this organization called NATO? ਇਹ ਜੋ NATO ਹੈ ਇਹ ਕਿਸ ਦਾ ਅਲਾਈਅੰਸ ਹੈ? ਯੂਕਰੇਨ we understand is not a member of NATO. ਸਾਨੂੰ ਥੋੜਾ ਜਿਹਾ ਬੈਕਗ੍ਰਾਉਂਡ ਇਸ NATO ਦਾ ਸਮਝਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ?
Yeah, Harjot, definitely. NATO, if you see after the Second World War, and again, if you look at the history of the Second World War, after the Second World War was over, Germany was divided into two, East Germany and West Germany, and the Russian forces reached Germany before the Allied forces, and Stalin wanted to, make sure that the Allied forces did not reach before he did. And from there on, after the war was over, everybody knew that this is going to be a new era, that there's going to be a conflict, or at least some kind of conflict between Russians and the Allied members and United States. So NATO was founded then. There were some founding members of NATO. I believe there was Germany and UK and US and Turkey was also one of them. But I could be stand corrected over there. But ਜਿਹੜਾ NATO ਦਾ ਜਿਹੜਾ whole concept ਸੀਗਾ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੇ allied after the learnings of Second World War ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ allied ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ forces ਸੀ they have a union of some sort, they have a team of some sort, they have budget of some sort ਕਿ ਕੱਲ ਨੂੰ ਕੁਝ ਹੁੰਦਾ ਹੈ World War like situation, then they defend those countries together.
NATO ਵਿੱਚ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਕੰਟਰੀਜ਼ ਹੈਗੀ ਆ US, Germany, France, England, ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ opposite ਵੀ ਕੋਈ group ਹੋਣਾ? What group is that? I believe led by Russia.
So there is not a defined group as such, but again, off lately, ਜੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਹੁਣ international politics follow ਕਰੋ, so the Chinese are doing military exercises together with Russians. They've also included Iranians to a certain extent as well. So there's almost like a parallel axis of countries which are probably standing up towards the West, and you can also include Syria in them. I mean, Syria is not a very powerful country, but again, you can also add Venezuela. Some of these rogue countries where you have proper dictatorship. Belarus could be another one. These are some prime examples of allies of Russia, so to speak.
So ਜੋ ਅਸੀਂ ਸਮਝਣ ਦੀ ਕੋਸ਼ਿਸ਼ ਕਰ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ ਕਿ ਦੋ ਪਾਵਰ ਬਲੌਕਸ ਹੈਗੇ, ਇੱਕ NATO ਦਾ ਹੈਗਾ led by US and ਇੱਕ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਹੈਗਾ ਉਹ ਹੈਗਾ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਦਾ ਬਲੌਕ, ਰਾਈਟ? ਨਾਓ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਇਹ ਬਲੌਕ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਵੇਲੇ ਕੋਈ the days of Cold War are over, ਕੋਈ ਐਕਟਿਵ ਲੜਾਈ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਆਪਸ ਵਿੱਚ ਨਹੀਂ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਪਈ। ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਸਮਝਾ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ why is NATO going into Ukraine? NATO is not even Ukraine is not even part of NATO, right?
NATO has an open door policy. If any democratic country, I think that is a prerequisite for NATO membership. If somebody wants to become a member of NATO and they approach NATO and they have serious security concerns, and they are in the European region or even otherwise, they have an open door policy. So, and that is described in their documents. So. A lot of, if you look at the history since the breakaway of USSR in 1991, NATO has expanded into Eastern European sector and added about 14 new countries since 1991 or 1990 onwards. So if you look at the map of Russia, pretty much, I mean, if you watch BBC or CNN, ਉਹਦੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਕਲੀਅਰਲੀ ਡਿਫਾਈਨ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਨ ਕਿ ਮਿਸਟਰ ਪੁਟਿਨ ਕਿਉਂ ਇੰਨੇ ਐਂਗਰੀ ਹੈ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਸਾਰੇ ਸਰਾਊਂਡਿੰਗ ਕੰਟਰੀਜ਼ ਮੋਸਟ ਆਫ them have now become NATO members except for Ukraine ਜਿਨ੍ਹਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਆਫਰ ਕੀਤੀ ਗਈ ਹੈ ਕਿ you can be a member but obviously subject to a lot of conditions.
ਕੀ ਹੈਜ਼ਿਟੇਸ਼ਨ ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ NATO ਦਾ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਬਣਾਉਣ ਵਿੱਚ? ਆਈ ਅੰਡਰਸਟੈਂਡ ਕਿ ਉਹ ਉਹਦੇ EU ਦੇ ਵੀ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਨਹੀਂ ਬਣੇ.
So, ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ hesitation ਨਹੀਂ ਹੈ. I think eventually they would want to, but because of the conflict in 2014, they were offered that they're going to bring them on board. That is one of the biggest pain points for Mr. Putin, that Ukraine is the last country, which is a big country out there in Eastern Europe. You're not talking about Estonia or Latvia and some of these smaller nations. Ukraine is a big nation, right? So that is one of the biggest conflict points of this potential conflict going into a warlike situation, is that Russia doesn't want Ukraine to become a NATO member. So that is why Mr. Putin floated these two documents, which are essentially not acceptable by either United States or NATO, that, they basically said that we want all NATO forces to be out of Russian breakaway countries. We don't want NATO to bring Ukraine as a member of NATO, and also US to give a guarantee that NATO will not expand in Eastern Europe and not bring on Ukraine as a potential member of NATO.
ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਵਾਲ ਪੁੱਛ ਰਿਹਾ ਇਸ ਦੀ ਵਜ੍ਹਾ ਹੀ ਆਈ ਹੈ ਕਿਉਂਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜਾ ਸਾਰਾ ਕਨਫਲਿਕਟ ਹੈ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਪਿਊਟਿਨ ਦੀ ਦੋ ਡਿਮਾਂਡਸ ਕਿ ਇੱਕ ਯੂਕਰੇਨ ਨੂੰ ਮੈਂਬਰ ਨਾ ਬਣਾਇਆ ਜਾਏ ਨੇਟੋ ਦਾ, ਔਰ ਦੂਸਰਾ ਕਿ ਜੋ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਐਸਟੈਬਲਿਸ਼ਮੈਂਟ ਨੇਟੋ ਕਰਦੀ ਪਈ ਹੈ ਅਰਾਊਂਡ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ, in Central America and in Central Europe and Eastern Europe, ਉਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਐਸਟੈਬਲਿਸ਼ਮੈਂਟਸ ਹੈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਉੱਥੇ ਚੁੱਕਿਆ ਜਾਏ, right? If these are true, let me use the word enemy groups, NATO and the group led by Russia, why are these demands unfair? Why would they allow military? ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਯਾਦ ਹੈ ਜਦ ਕਿਊਬਨ ਮਿਸਾਈਲ ਕ੍ਰਾਈਸਿਸ ਹੋਇਆ ਸੀਗਾ, ਰਾਈਟ? ਕਿਊਬਾ ਵਿੱਚ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੇ ਮਿਸਾਈਲਸ ਆਏ, ਅਮਰੀਕਾ ਵਾਸ ਵੈਰੀ ਅਨਹੈਪੀ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਡੇ ਦੇ ਨੇੜੇ ਕਿਉਂ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, whereas ਉਸਦਾ ਜੋ ਪ੍ਰੈਸੀਡੈਂਟ ਹੈ that was America going to Turkey and doing those missile installations there. But what we're trying to understand is, why is Putin wrong in what he's demanding? ਕਿ ਬਈ ਇੱਥੇ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹ ਮਿਲਟਰੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਇੰਨੀ ਡਿਪਲੋਇਮੈਂਟ ਕਰਦੇ ਪਏ ਔਰ ਨੇਟੋ ਨੂੰ ਲੈ ਕੇ ਆ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, ਉਹ ਨਾ ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਏ. Why is it wrong?
No, so I agree with you fundamentally. I mean, if United States thought that Cuban Missile Crisis were a big security issue, then he has every right to understand that or think that expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe or breakaway USSR countries is not right for Russia. So he's got that right. But dekho ji, Mr. Putin the jada baggage hai, I mean, if you look at Russia today, it is not a democratic country anymore. And there are no political parties as such. There's no free speech. There's only one opposition to Mr. Putin, Mr. Navalny, who's in jail for his lifetime. So, and he has done so many different things across the world which stand out as being a dictator. So morally, when the West looks at it and says, listen, okay, fine, you may have a valid concern about security, but look at yourself first. Right? That is the argument the West is making, that we want the world to be democratic, right? We don't want a dictatorship or a communist this thing. So, and the fundamental principles of West differ from the fundamental principles of Mr. Putin. And again, if you have an open door policy, koi country कहती है we want to join your bloc, so they're free to do it. You know, at that point of time, the Cuban Missile Crisis, OEC, you know, Cuba is still a very small country, and it doesn't, and yes, US also flexed its muscles at that point of time. So you're right in a way, but the fundamental principles are wrong from where Russia is coming from.
Absolutely. I think the fear is, as you said, it's a dictatorship. You know, it's a corrupt regime. Or it's more like spreading their tentacles, even you know, if within those the countries which are part of the USSR at one time, and we can deny the immense amount of corruption that's prevalent under the Russian regime, the present regime. Gursher, ਅਸੀਂ ਥੋੜੀ NATO ਦੀ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਫੰਡਿੰਗ ਵਗੈਰਾ ਅਸੀਂ NATO ਨੂੰ ਸਮਝਣਾ ਚਾਹ ਰਹੇ ਹਾਂ, because we understand this is primarily a conflict between NATO and Russia. As we understand, America is sitting 5,000 miles away. They don't have a direct role here. But NATO, it's under the umbrella of NATO. It's a NATO organization. We understand President Trump is he was not very happy with the funding, the contributions of other countries. What are the sources of funding for this organization?
Yeah, so if you look at NATO today as an organization from the early 1990s, I mean, it's expanded. It's basically doubled itself in terms of the countries which are member. Right now, I think there are about 29 countries which are NATO members. Before the breakaway of USSR, there were about 15 or 14 members. So it's doubled in size from a country numbers perspective. But a lot of these are smaller countries. They cannot defend themselves. I mean, you talk about Estonia, Latvia, and things like that. They really don't have any means and the money to do so, or the international clout to do so. Now, if you look at the funding of NATO, NATO's military defense spending last year was approximately $1.2 trillion. 70% of that funding comes from the United States, about 69 or 70%. So about $811 billion are funded by.
Gursher, I'm sorry कि मैं ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਇੱਥੇ ਵਿੱਚ ਡਿਸਟਰਬ ਕਰ ਰਿਹਾ ਤੁਹਾਡੀ ਥਾਟ ਨੂੰ। ਇੱਕ ਸਮਾਂ ਹੈ, ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦਾ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਜਾਰੀ ਰੱਖਾਂਗੇ। ਇੱਕ ਛੋਟੀ ਜੀ ਬ੍ਰੇਕ ਦੇ ਬਾਅਦ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਰਹੋ ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ। ਦ ਵੇ ਫਾਰਵਰਡ ਇਸ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਫਿਰ ਤੋਂ ਸਵਾਗਤ ਹੈ। ਮੈਂ ਤੁਹਾਡਾ ਹੋਸਟ ਹਰਜੋਤ ਸਿੰਘ। Gursher, break ਤੇ ਜਾਣ ਤੋਂ ਪਹਿਲਾਂ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਸੀਗੇ ਕਿ NATO ਦੀ ਫੰਡਿੰਗ ਬਾਰੇ। So 70% ਜੋ ਫੰਡਿੰਗ ਹੈ ਉਹ US ਕਰਦਾ ਹੈ। Is that right?
Yes, Harjot. So about 70%, if you look at the last year's number, out of the $1.2 trillion, about $811 billion, and these are all estimates, right? Not actual numbers. But about 69 to 70% was US. That's increased spending of about 24%. Year over year, or about 24% since 2014. The overall NATO spending has gone up since 2014 with the Jadonda Crimea annex OIC. So having said that, 30% is the remaining 27, 28 countries.
Gursher, we've seen कि कुछ written response देता है NATO ने, US ने, to Putin's demands. Do you see any de-escalation happening? क्या उसका कोई response मिलिया हाली सानू?
I think वो response हजे कल ही गए ने, written responses ਜਿਹੜੇ ਸੀਗੇ both from NATO and from United States. But ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਪਤਾ ਹੀ ਹੈ ਜਿਹੜੇ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੇ demands ਨੇ obscure demands ਰੱਖੀ ਸੀਗੀਆਂ, ਉਹ ਨਾ NATO ਨੂੰ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਹੀ agreeable ਸੀ, ਨਾ United States ਨੂੰ ਸ਼ੁਰੂ ਤੋਂ ਹੀ agreeable ਸੀਗੀ, ਤੇ they were non-starters from day one. So having said that, a lot of analysts, a lot of people globally and contributors and defense strategists are thinking that this is basically Mr. Putin's move, that as ਹੀ ਸ਼ਰਤਾਂ ਰੱਖੋ ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ accept ਹੀ ਨਹੀਂ ਹੋਣਗੀ ਤਾਂ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਇੱਕ reason ਮਿਲ ਜੂਗਾ invade ਕਰਨ ਦਾ।
ਜੀ। And कई लोग ये कह रहे हैं कि the intent is not to invade, but it's only to कि ਜਿਹੜੀ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਆਪਣੀ internal ਉੱਥੇ politics ਹੈਗੀ ਹੈ ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਵਿੱਚ, ਉਸ ਦਾ ਕਾਫੀ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ situation ਉੱਥੇ ਕਾਫੀ precarious ਹੈ, ਤੇ ਉਹ ਇੱਕ divergent tactics ਹੈ, nothing more than that. ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਿਵੇਂ ਵੇਖਦੇ ਹੋ?
I think the real reason that Mr. Putin ਹੀ ਜਾਣਦੇ ਨੇ, but there are a lot of factors here at play. So multiple angles ਨਾਲ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਦੇਖ ਸਕਦੇ ਹੋ। ਇੱਕ ਹੈਗਾ ਕਿ Mr. Putin is trying to test everything, right? Test the strength of Ukraine standing up to Russia. Test how capable NATO is and how quickly NATO can respond, not to defend Ukraine, but overall, what really falls out from this thing. So, and eventually, what he has done is that he has shaken the diplomatic tree, right? And he's seeing what can come out of it. Whatever way you look at it, pretty much it's a win-win situation for Mr. Putin, right? So, ਤੁਸੀਂ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਹੋ ਕਿ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ sanctions ਕਰ ਦਾਂਗੇ, right? He's just trying to evaluate कि US ਕੀ ਕਰੂਗਾ. He's also testing the relationship of United States with NATO, United States with the biggest members of NATO, which is Germany, UK, and France. Germany is dependent upon, and Europe is dependent upon quite a bit on natural resources from Russia. Nord Stream 2 ਦੀ ਅਸੀਂ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ ਜਿਹੜੀ gas pipeline ਹੈ. So he's not only testing Ukraine, he's testing NATO, he's testing United States relationship with NATO, United States relationship with its biggest allies, which are France, UK, and Germany as well. So there are a lot of factors that play out here.
सारी कंट्री इसलिए वरीड, सारी दुनिया इसलिए वरीड है कि अगर ये लड़ाई होती है, it might not just be restricted to that portion of the world, it might spread out. China तो बहुत दुनिया सारी डरी हुई है. Do you think there's a possibility that China might join forces with Russia, or it might use this as an opportunity, to attack Taiwan maybe? Do you see anything like that happening?
According to me, China and Russia, eventually it's going to come out, if not in the next couple of years, in the 4-5 years, that China and Russia has a lot of common ground to cover internationally, right? So the influence, the sphere of influence, right? China wants to control more and more, so does Russia. China wants to expand in Africa. China is expanding in Africa. China is expanding in Latin America. China wanted to expand in Australia, but with the last deal, उन्होंने block करता होते. So China is also becoming bullish, and the number one key thing what China wants is obviously Taiwan back. So जे Russia हुन invade करता है, this also gives excuse to China कि जे Russia Ukraine ਨੂੰ invade करता है या portion ले लेंदा है या पूरा ले लेंदा है या कुछ भी करता है, so why can't China do? उन्हां ਲਈ ਤਾਂ excuse मिल गया, right? So it is going to play down. Globally, it's going to play down as a very negative spiraling effect on the overall situation what China is trying to do with Taiwan.
But क्या China ने ऐसा कोई इंडिकेशन दिया है इस वेले कि अगर इधर दी सिचुएशन बनती है, they might think of some misadventure as well? China
is very smart, so they're not going to say anything because they don't need to. Right now, they're just sitting back and seeing how everything is playing out. Russia ki karta, how does US respond? How does NATO respond? And the other European countries respond to that. But China is also using this as a study, right? Ki kal mujhe ye karta hai, what will happen to China, right? What could happen to China financially? Economic wise, international relationship wise, defense wise, right? So but again, so we will not know whether China wants to do it right now, but all indications are what is happening in the last 6 months to a year, the number of incursions which are happening in Taiwan and the statements which have been put out, and the fact that Mr. Xi Jinping has publicly said that China will eventually take over Taiwan is anybody's guess. The guess is when, it's not why.
Jai situation ਤੁਸੀਂ ਸਾਨੂੰ ਦੱਸ ਰਹੇ ਹੋ, that means there is an added pressure on NATO and on US to respond very strongly to this Russian aggression right now in Ukraine. Is that fair to say?
And that's what they are doing. I mean, I think that all the talks, with the exception of maybe a botched comment from Mr. Biden, other than that, I think that the way they are partnered with their biggest members of NATO and the European allies and responding to the threats of Mr. Putin, I think that they are on the right track. I mean, at the end of the day, unlike Mr. Putin, all these countries and the heads of states, whether it's France, UK, and United States or Germany, they are responsible towards the people, right? They are democratically elected. They have to think about so many things before they take a decision of pushing their country into war. Putin doesn't have to worry about any of those things. So it's easier for them to actually do things like this versus democratically elected governments and heads of states. So it becomes tricky, and he knows that, and that is the reason he's pushing the envelope right now.
Yeah, and sometimes it becomes, essential for his own existence, for his own survival in his own country. A diversion, a patriotism, the वो सारे चीज को provoke करना. Uh, you know, if something like that happens, if this war starts, then something is done by the Chinese as well. I think that pretty much declares the Third World War. Is it right to say?
I think it's still far-fetched, or I don't think we are at that stage. But given how the world is evolving and how partnerships are being built, and I don't think that I'll go as far as that there's a world war at play. I think the world has become much more mature and smarter, and wars in today's date could also be a cyber war, or it could be economic war. There are different kind of wars, right? It's not really that military is always involved. So there are different ways to counter it. But the situation, what we are seeing globally, how it's panning out in the last 4-5 years, and eventually I think in the next 10 years, there may be a event or two which could trigger a major conflict here and there, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's Middle East, whether it's Asia Pac. There are all possibilities of that.
And Gursher, जब ਅਸੀਂ economic sanctions ਦੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਦੇ ਹਾਂ, it's very, the world is more connected today through internet, through these cyber technologies than ever before. और ਜਿਹੜੀ इसलिए सब ਤੋਂ ਵੱਡੀ ਗੱਲ ਹੋ ਰਹੀ ਹੈ, we have seen these cyber attacks from it's alleged coming out of Russia or China. We can say for sure, but ਇੱਕ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਬੜੀ ਮੇਜਰ ਗੱਲ ਇਸ ਲਈ ਚੱਲਦੀ ਪਈ ਹੈ, that is ਕਿ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟੈਕਨੋਲੋਜੀ ਦਾ ਐਕਸਪੋਰਟ ਹੈ ਉਸਨੂੰ restrict ਕੀਤਾ ਜਾਏ, right? Coming out of this whole situation, that might be the way US and NATO allies react to Russia for the ongoing situation. Usde vich, the way the world economy is developing nowadays, what impact do you see on the global economy if something like that happens?
So local economy of United States or Europe or Russia?
Everywhere, the world is connected through internet right now, right? Through cyber. Agar jedi cyber ਅਸੀਂ ਇਹਨਾਂ ਨੂੰ ਥੋੜਾ ਸਕੇਲ ਬੈਕ ਕਰੀਏ, ਰਸ਼ੀਆ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਟੈਕਨੋਲੋਜੀ ਯੂਜ਼ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ, ਦੇ ਪ੍ਰਾਇਮਰੀਲੀ ਅਮਰੀਕਨ ਕੰਪਨੀਜ਼, ਰਾਈਟ, ਜੋ ਟੈਕਨੋਲੋਜੀ ਐਕਸਪੋਰਟ ਕਰਦੀ ਹੈ, would that create a different biosphere for business around the world?
Certainly, I think cybersecurity is the biggest concern of not just larger corporations in the United States or Europe, or I think it's globally, right? You're seeing that so many cyber attacks have happened on federal entities and state entities to natural gas and oil entities in the eastern part of the country about 6 months back from Russia. Now, having said that, I mean, again, you only get one side of the story. So I'm sure United States at certain level is also responding to them, whether it's in China and Chinese entities or Russian entities. We will never know that, right? But I'm sure that they're fully capable of doing the same to these. But overall economic impact and global impact, yeah, certainly, right? I mean, everything is connected. So today, your financial systems are connected, your trading platforms are connected, your communication streams are connected, your information data is all connected, where it's hosted in servers or cloud servers and stuff like that. So it does pose a big threat going forward economically, whether it's one country or globally. Yes, you have to be cognizant of the fact that you have to invest more and more towards cybersecurity and data security going forward as we move in this next era of countering China and Russia.
some good take it.
The entire Middle East, most of the countries are pegged on US dollar. That means US dollar is their actual currency. Panama in Latin America has US dollar as their currency. Ecuador has US dollar as their currency. There are many countries which actually use and trade on US dollars as their own currency. They may call it something else, like in UAE, they might call it dirhams or so. But at the end of the day, it's US dollars. So I don't think it's going to have a big impact. But again, they can say what they want.
Is सारी situation what do you see as the impact on the rest of the world, like in Asia, India जैसी countries के ऊपर की असर देखते हो तुसी?
India nu ta obviously bigger problem India like the China hai, right? So if Russia moves into Ukraine, China can tomorrow say, hey, listen, we're going to take our territory back from Arunachal Pradesh or Ladakh, which they claim, and which is obviously not right because it's India's territory. So all they need is an excuse to be more bullish. So it doesn't help India's cause over there. But again, India is also standing up to China. But you don't want a distraction, where we need to be focused about jobs and economic growth and addressing poverty in India, to be diverting that funds. I mean, India is already spending like $70 billion in defense spending. That's the top 5 in more than Russia, as a matter of fact. Now, whether it's an apples to apples comparison, it's anybody's guess. But that kind of defense spending can be used somewhere else more productively.
जो आज ਤੁਹਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਸਾਰੀ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਕੇ ਅਸੀਂ ਇੰਪ੍ਰੈਸ਼ਨ ਲਿੱਤਾ ਹੈ, you don't seem to be that worried कि ਜਿਹੜੀ ਲੜਾਈ ਹੈ impending और immediate होने लगी है. Is that right? Am I reading it right?
I don't think there's an immediate threat. When I say immediate, I don't think it's going to happen in the next 4 or 5 days. But it could happen in the next few weeks if it has to happen. My sense is we are trending towards that. And that's my biggest fear, that another conflict may impact a lot of things. It can impact stock markets out here. A lot of people, a lot of companies and businesses can be impacted as well. But मैंने लग रहा है जो कुछ होगा तो अगले हफ्ते 10 दिन you could see something like this happening. I hope it doesn't happen, but right now the way it's been positioned, and obviously Mr. Putin doesn't want to walk away with this in his country, as saying he backed off. So it's also, as you said, he wants to play to the domestic crowd, and that is also big on his agenda. So he has to do something.
So to see on the weeks, which what do you see happening? Do you see some concessions from each side? What do you see happening in the next few weeks?
I think if there is no diplomatic solution found in the next few days until the Beijing Olympics finishes, then you may definitely see a conflict. Now, the nature of conflict could be large or small or medium scale. It really depends upon what Mr. Putin thinks is good enough for him. Whether it's taking another piece of land from Ukraine, that's good enough. Whether he goes for all-out invasion of Ukraine, that means flying in his planes and his air force from Belarus and attacking Kiev. That is also a possibility if he wants to do that. But again, I don't think that he's going to go into an all-out invasion. He may want to prove that he did it and he said it and he did it. He might take another chunk of Ukraine, and that's about it. And there might be more sanctions, or there could be a diplomatic solution right between Ukraine and Russia with the help of some of the European nations. I mean, that's another set of meetings which are happening on the side, and then you have US and Russia also directly engaged as well.
Gursher, आज साढ़े वास्ते एक breakdown करने का तो बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया. I'm hopeful after I spoke with you, you sound to be more optimistic कि वो जेडे झगड़ा जिसको ਅਸੀਂ फेयर करते पे हैं, जिस all out लड़ाई को ਅਸੀਂ फेयर करते पे हैं, वो शायद at least इस वेले ना होए. But we'll keep a close watch on the situation. किस तरह से डेवलप होंदी है सिचुएशन, ਅਸੀਂ ਤੁਹਾਨੂੰ ਦੁਬਾਰਾ ਰਿਕੁਐਸਟ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ ਕਿ ਤੁਸੀਂ ਆ ਕੇ ਸਾਡੇ ਵਾਸਤੇ ਬ੍ਰੇਕਡਾਊਨ ਕਰੋ, ਸਾਨੂੰ ਇਹ ਸਮਝਾਓ. ਅੱਜ ਸਾਡੇ ਨਾਲ ਗੱਲ ਕਰਨ ਦਾ ਬਹੁਤ ਬਹੁਤ ਸ਼ੁਕਰੀਆ.
Thank you, Harjot. Thank you for having me. Always a pleasure.
Thank you. ਇਹ ਸੀਗਾ ਸਾਡਾ ਅੱਜ ਦਾ ਸ਼ੋਅ. ਅਸੀਂ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਨੂੰ ਕਲੋਜ਼ਲੀ ਵਾਚ ਕਰਾਂਗੇ. We just hope ਕਿ ਇਹ ਜਿਹੜੀ ਸਿਚੁਏਸ਼ਨ ਹੈ ਇਹ ਫੁੱਲ ਆਊਟ ਵਾਰ ਵਿੱਚ ਐਸਕੇਲੇਟ ਨਾ ਹੋਏ. दोनों साइड इसलिए गल करती पई हैं, बट असी सारी जी जानकारी है तुहाडे वास्ते तुहाडे सामने लैके आंदे रहांगे। तुसीं वेखदे रहो द वे फॉरवर्ड।